Hey, everybody, it's Susan Lindner. I'm your host of the Innovation Storyteller Show. And today we have a really special guest. It's very rare that we have folks on from the pharmaceutical industry. And with everything that we've experienced, whether it's COVID or a simple cold, we know that pharma and the medicines that underpin the health of our lives are so important to how we function in the world. Innovation in the pharma space seems to be something that we just take for granted. We just naturally assume that this is a place where great innovation is always happening as new diseases, new outcomes, new breakthroughs in research lead us to these next big pharma breakthroughs, but it doesn't happen on its own. And that's why I'm so excited to have Michelle Shogren here with me today. So Michelle was the former Senior Director of Innovation Pharma R&D at Bayer, one of the biggest pharmaceutical companies in the world. And she actually started the innovation function at Bayer and scaled it across 11 different functions. So she recently announced the launch of her own consultancy, Innovate in What You Do. And Michelle leverages a combination of over 25 years of experience in clinical trials, 9 years in driving innovation, and a lifetime passion for helping people and patients to help companies turn creative ideas into very innovative results. Michelle, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for the invite, Susan.
Yeah. So, just at the top of the top, how did you even get into this space, Michelle? None of us majored in innovation in college. So how did you find yourself here in innovation?
I think with all great things, you have a tendency to fall into it. I fell into clinical trials and I also fell into innovation. I was constantly thinking there's got to be a better way to do things. How can we push the needle forward? How can we drive change or something like that? And I was able to participate in an initiative looking at innovation for pharma R&D and fell in love. I said, this is my space. This is where I belong. This is what I need to do. I can really help people here and help patients around the world by doing it. And I started studying, got certified in many different innovation methodologies, and was able to bring that back into Bayer and help our different colleagues tackle all kinds of things.
Wow. And so, to my point in this opening, we just naturally assume that innovation is a core functionality of research and development at a big company, and especially one that specializes in medical breakthroughs. So how did this all come about, and how was it that Bayer didn't have innovation at that point when you launched it?
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, Bayer was always an innovative company. And when you look at creating new molecules, that's the heart of innovation too. But the funny thing was we had innovation all around the Bayer Pharma world, whether it was after a drug came to market and we were having to figure out how do we launch this, how do we get it to the people that need it, or it was in the very, very beginning in the bench research part where we were trying to find those new molecules or new uses. But there was a gap that was there. And that was once we had the molecule and we had to run it through the clinical trial process, here, everyone thought it was so difficult or so regulated that we couldn't really innovate a whole lot. We had to really follow all the rules and regulations. There wasn't a lot of movement or leeway for innovation. And talking amongst different people, we decided that's probably not the case. And we really do need it. And there's innovation that's beyond finding the molecule itself that's important to be able to drive things forward and get drugs to market faster to the people who really need it on the other side.
Mm. And so clinical trials is one of those things that we think of as being at the cutting edge. So why clinical trials for you? Why was that important to get involved with out of all the spheres that, big pharma touches?
So when I was 18, I was suffering from migraine headaches really bad. It was impacting everything. And it had gotten worse and worse over a period of time. And I joined a clinical trial because all the medications that were out there just wasn't working for me. It was my first exposure to a clinical trial. And it helped me so much. I got lucky. Not all clinical trials will work. That, there's a lot that fail, unfortunately, but I got lucky. And the one that I went into really made a difference. But the complexity of the clinical trial and the things that they asked me to do and the burden was really kind of bothersome for me. And I
What were
almost
some of
didn't
those
complete
things,
it.
Michelle? What did you need to do?
I had to go into the office every 4 weeks, and that meant I had to miss work, or I had to, take time away. The office hours were the same as my work hours. So I had to explain to somebody, which is a little embarrassing to have to talk to your work about the fact that, oh, I have to go to the doctor every 4 weeks. They think, oh my gosh, what happened? Are you dying? What's going on with you? So that was problematic. But then also some of my days, I was there for several hours, and you're sitting and waiting, and then you do a little test, and then you sit and wait and do another test. Or I'd have tons and tons of lab draws over a period of time too. And that was important, which I know now, to be able to check to see how the medication's working and how's it being processed through your system. I didn't know at 18. So I was really frustrated. I skipped ahead a couple of years, and I go to school to be a nurse, and I fall into clinical research again because my friend was doing it. And all of a sudden, all those memories came back. And I was like, oh, this is a space that I have to be in, and we have to make it better, because people don't want to do what I had to do. Even when there's the benefit that came from it, it's still so burdensome. And so I knew I needed to be in clinical trials, and I knew I could help people here.
Amazing. Amazing. And so having firsthand experience with that, it puts a whole different spin on it, right? And I imagine you have far more gravitas in those conversations about what needs to change, what needs to be innovative, having experienced it yourself.
Yes, I think that that's the great thing about life is if you're smart and you pay attention to everything that happens along your journey, you can bring the good baggage along with you and make a difference too. So that was one of those things.
Well said, Michelle. So tell us about, I know that you've been doing some really avant-garde work, and especially working to accelerate great ideas at Bayer, and especially this concept of decentralized clinical trials. For folks in the audience who are not familiar with the clinical trials process, or the centralization versus the decentralization of it, can you give us a little bit about what the status quo was, and then what looking at decentralized clinical trials?
Yeah, happy to do that. For years and years, I think since the conception of clinical trials, it was a traditional model where you would always go into the research site in order to have your exams. Just like I mentioned, when I was 18 and having to go in every 4 weeks, that was pretty standard cadence for clinical trials. You'd come in every 4 to 6 weeks. You're going to see the doctor. They're going to evaluate you in that moment in time, right? How are you doing today in this second? We can't really know how you were for the last 5 weeks when you were gone, but we can know how you are now. And then we make decisions about your health, and then you go away and you come back again. So the frequency is much more than going to your regular doctor. Most of us don't see the regular doctor that often. Maybe you see them every 3 months, 6 months, maybe even only once a year. So it's a big difference there. What the decentralized clinical trial approach is focusing on is the fact that there are lots of people who can't do that. It's very, very difficult for them to do it. And it's might be because of the fact that transportation's an issue. It might be getting off from work could be an issue. There's so many different things that can limit people. And only 5% of the population ever know about clinical trials or get offered a clinical trial. And when you then further reduce that funnel, it's problematic. So we said, how can we make this available to more people and have a chance to have this as a care option for them as well? And that would speed up our time to market for drugs. We saw with all of the COVID studies, everybody heard about clinical trials because of COVID-19. And those things came to market so fast. Everybody got nervous. Like, why did they come so fast? Well, because everybody was volunteering to be in the trials. We didn't have to find people. That's not the way it is in a normal study. Normally, it takes years sometimes to find enough people for your study. And that's why it takes so long to get a drug to market. So the decentralized clinical trial approach is all about bringing the study to you as a patient instead of having to bring the patient to the site. So that means leveraging technology. It might be more telemedicine visits from time to time. So you can do it from your desk at work, or, from your home on your couch. and then come in when you really have to come in for certain exams or things like that. So I see it as an opportunity to really diversify our clinical trials and also create that health equity in our clinical trials if it's done properly. And now our technology is finally getting to the point where we can trust it and leverage it to do these things and still be able to keep the patient safe, which is always the most important thing of trials.
So I do want to get into this health equity topic, but can you walk us through how you introduced, how you introduced decentralized clinical trials to Bayer? Because this is a massive shift. I mean, we're thinking about the infrastructure. We're thinking about this very top-down doctor-centric approach, right? Where the patient must come to you, must be followed. And we want them to be under close supervision when they're trying new drugs that have never been human tested before, right? So it is imperative to have this close relationship. So tell us about what it takes to actually implement, to float the idea, to get the buy-in, to move that. What's the story that you told internally, Michelle, in order to get this concept through?
Yeah, so just to be clear, as an industry, we're all working together towards this concept. So Bayer was not necessarily the first one that jumped on it. There were other companies that were starting there. I would call us a fast follower probably in the space.
Mhm.
And, but even within that, once we say, hey, this is a really good idea, it makes sense. We have to figure out when is it fit for purpose. So you brought up a really good point. Depending on the patient journey, depends on when this is a good time to introduce this model. So if it's the first time in humans and we're using healthy volunteers to be able to test over a short amount of time, that's always done still at a hospital on site. And we monitor you so we know how things are going before you even know how they're going to keep you safe and we wanted to bring you right back to the happy, healthy person you were when you walked in the door when you leave. So phase 1 studies don't really qualify for something like this. It wouldn't make sense. Phase 2 studies, which is where we say, okay, now we know that it's safe for people. Let's try it in the ones who have the condition and see if it's going to work. And then also, what's the lowest amount of drug we can give you in order to have efficacy for it to still work? And those also, they're a little bit harder to have a good match for the decentralized approach because we're checking so many things so often. But the phase 3 studies, which are, okay, now we know it's safe, it appears to be effective, but we need to try it on a larger population. These are perfect. So we have thousands of patients in these studies, and they're usually longer studies for more data generation opportunities, right? And at that point, we said, these are really perfect for decentralized clinical trials. Also, we have to look at where you are in your own personal journey. So that's the journey of the phases of trials. But what about you as a patient? If you're just first getting diagnosed with something, say someone tells you that you have cancer, you are not going to all of a sudden want to just be at home all the time. You're going to want that care. You're going to want to go in, you want to see your doctor, you want to feel the support of your care team around you, right? So in that case, maybe it's not a good match. But after diagnosis and you're in maintenance or you're in follow-up, that's perfect for it. So we find a fit for purpose. But I think at Bayer, one of the big things that we had was we saw value, but people were afraid to try new things. Like anytime you say, well, the status quo seems to be working, why should I change? You deal with change management and you say, how can I fix this? And that's where innovation got more involved to say, we have to be able to do this. We have to find a way. And how do we help the adoption? Because people would say, oh, it's a great thing, but not in my study. Thank you. Somebody else can do it. So.
Well, so getting this idea through, was that a challenge at Bayer, even for that, that group that, was typically, because I imagine there's a whole infrastructure set up just for that purpose.
Yeah, so when you talk about a business challenge, decentralized clinical trials pose a business challenge for every single user along the journey, whether it was the study team trying to figure out how do I coordinate getting drugs sent to different places or having a home nurse go instead of having the patient come into the office. How do I coordinate the security of the custody of control of the drug itself going different places. There was all these kind of things. Also, how do I deal with the data that's going to come in from these new devices that are going to help me monitor it? How do I make sense of the data? How do I store the data? All these problems were there. Then when you go to the research site, so the doctors and nurses that are doing the studies, all of a sudden they're being asked to be, somehow technology gods and goddesses out there, where before they used to just do medicine, and they were also, the relationship with their patients are so important. When you trust somebody about making decisions about your health, you want to feel like they're knowledgeable and they know what's going on. So we always put those people up on a pillar. And now we're saying, here, have all this technology, figure out these devices, and be able to be that first line to troubleshoot with a patient. And they thought, this is not what I signed up for. I didn't sign up for tech. I signed up for medical. What is going on here? And they didn't want to disrupt that relationship with their patients, right? And then when you get to the patients, some of them were like, oh, I've never worked this way before. I don't know how it is. Maybe I'm not going to be as like supported in this model. Maybe I won't really have as much of a connection with my doctor anymore. And so we had to figure that out. So there were all these fears, but when you look at benefits before challenges, you say, wow, there's so many benefits that could come from this, and it can really help so many people. It was worth saying, how do we tackle those challenges? And that was one of the things that the innovation group kind of went into. We had somebody come up with an idea, and we said, oh, okay, let's put it in our idea greenhouse, and let's see if we can nurture that idea a little bit and foster it and give it a little room to grow and test some things out and see what can happen. And we were able to make a huge business model change to be able to drive these things going forward and to learn a lot on the process.
So did that shift also create new efficiencies where you don't have, so many patients coming into the facility anymore, right? You have like other things are changing. Can you give us like what's on the other side of the slope of the great idea? So, we have this fantastic idea. We know there's bumps along the way. We get buy-in from other groups, and then we launch. And then what were some of the outcomes you found from an efficiency standpoint, or maybe even a productivity or efficacy standpoint?
One of the biggest things that is so wonderful about decentralized clinical trials are the fact that we're able to monitor patients throughout their journey. So not just, remember I said I came in and then they would see how I'm doing for that day, but they had no idea really what happened to me in between. Now with these devices, we can really see what's happening with the patient in real life. We used to do like this 6-meter walk test where we would try to see, how is your breathing, your stability, how's your endurance to be able to walk, and you'd walk around a doctor's office. And now we don't have to do it that way anymore, because that's a pretend situation. That's not when it matters. When it matters, can you do these things, is when you're at the grocery store and you're pushing that cart and it has all kinds of stuff in it. How long can you push the cart? How many laps can you make around the grocery store, which you're dealing with other people? That's the data that we're now able to get and see. We're also able to see more about, are there certain times or things that influence a patient's health, their well-being, and different activities that might play a role in it. So I think the data about patients themselves and them getting that information is also really important and helpful here as a big outcome. As far as efficiencies, we're still moving the needle. We're still getting this going and running more often. We're finally at the point now where Bayer says for every study that comes in, we do an assessment to see, does it match a decentralized clinical trial model, which is huge. That means it's operationalized now. It's not just something that you're stuck in Pilotville where you say, hey, let's pilot it here, let's pilot it there. Now we're not we anymore, but they're looking at it on a regular basis. And I think that became more efficient too. We have processes to evaluate things much easier, and there's a regular flow. And we also have a better structure to look at all the different vendors that are necessary to make this happen. For the sites, having patients come in or having them do telemedicine visits, that has gone back and forth. People like it, they don't like it. The sites that do the telemedicine visits themselves, they really like it because they don't have to worry about having a patient wait in the waiting room. They can transition much better between patients, so their flow is more efficient. But for the sites that say, hey, we don't want to do the telemedicine visit and we have some other person doing those visits for them, sometimes they still are like, oh, someone else is in my territory, someone else is taking care of my patient that I love. So that's a little bit of a change management still that we're working with.
Yeah. So I gotta imagine, for the frontline healthcare worker who's used to having that hands-on interaction to now switch to telemedicine, in some cases, how's that?
So we had, there's this thing called fixedness when you talk about innovation, and it means that you have some idea or concept in your head, and it seems like that's the only way it could possibly be. And we had that when it came to telemedicine. We thought sites are not going to want to do this and they're going to push back. But then we also know COVID, well, it was not something I would recommend us to do on a regular basis. And it was actually a really good catalyst for change. All of these doctors' offices were having to switch to telemedicine. So many doctors became where they were providing these services to their doctors. So then it wasn't so scary anymore for them. And they said, oh, okay, we can do this. That was a catalyst for change for our decentralized clinical trials too. And they've gotten to the point where they embrace it. We do identify one size fits all approaches never work. If they can't work on a t-shirt that you're buying at the store, they definitely can't work on something as complex as clinical trials. But we've started to learn, when can you do the telemedicine visits and they work really well, and when do you really need to bring them in? So now it's really fit for purpose, which is also better.
So let's talk about this equity and access to clinical trials, because it's certainly something that large companies are beginning to think more of, not just in terms of, wow, is my data accurate, but rather, how have I been neglecting all these markets all this time? Right? Which isn't to say patients haven't been given proper pharmaceuticals. It's just that there's a whole world of opportunity and insight and feedback that we've been ignoring.
Yeah. And this is something that's really close to my heart too, is that looking at, are we ensuring diversity in our clinical trials? Are we ensuring that everybody who might potentially take this medication later on has someone who looks or resembles them, their makeup, their background, their culture, whatever, in our clinical trial space as well? When we did a industry-wide analysis of clinical trial participants, it's like 90+% Caucasian males. So this is a problem, right? This is not where we need to be. And it wasn't ever done on purpose. That it didn't happen that way, because we said, oh, this is our target population. It was never that. It was unconsciously, we were excluding people without realizing it. When you start thinking about having to come into the doctor's office every 4 weeks, well, if you are someone who are a skilled labor worker and you have to work, and you work during those hours, and if you don't work, you don't get paid, you don't have vacation time, you don't have time off, and you have to provide for your family, you're going to choose not to do a clinical trial. You're going to choose to provide for your family. And there's a huge group of people then that are now not represented. You miss out on a huge population. Also, sometimes in how we write the inclusion exclusion requirements, or the, hey, have this or don't have this list of being part of a clinical trial, we unintentionally exclude people. So for example, we recently realized that depending on the cholesterol levels that you say have to be at a certain point in order to be in the trial, you could exclude like a whole group or a whole culture because they typically have higher cholesterol. So that's a problem too. So it was never on purpose. Like there was always a reason for everything that was there, but now we're more aware and we can address it better. So
there is a certain sense of
all
like,
of that.
there is a certain myopia about that though, isn't there? And I say this as an anthropologist, right? Where you want to, it's not that just that we're inclusive so that everybody gets along, right? It's that we're missing really important data.
Yeah.
When we say like, okay, people have a certain cholesterol level, but then there are people who are genetically have higher cholesterol levels, or culturally,
Mhm.
And that data could be revealing so much brilliant information, and we're just leaving it on the table.
Yeah.
So important just to, put a red circle around that group, but continue, to research, because we need the data so desperately.
Yeah. And the fact of the matter is, everything's clean and sterile in a clinical trial environment. But when it goes to market, people do weird stuff.
Oh,
So,
yeah.
there's going to be people who take it that maybe you didn't plan on taking it. Or there's going to be people who they were really good in the trial as far as what they were doing with their diet, maybe. But when they are in the real world, now that's not really the same. It could even be the same person with dramatically different results. So I think that's a big piece. The thing with decentralized trials, though, is now it allows us to have a better understanding of these people because we're able to bring the trial to them. And the other thing is it's pushed for a movement across the industry to really say, hey, how do we test the patient voice here? How do we figure out are the things we're sharing? Because that was another piece, like our health literacy was a big problem, So a lot of things that we said were really high level. We weren't bringing it down to the reading level that we should do just in general. We always had the goal in our informed consents to be at a certain reading level, but we were always a little above it anyways. Now we realize it's not even just that. You have to plan and prepare differently for different cultures, and even sharing information about people for them to be in a trial can vary greatly. Well, you'd have some cultures where they want to bring the whole family into the doctor's office to have a discussion about being in the trial. And you have other ones where they're like, I don't want anyone to know, it's just me. So we have to be able to help and plan for that too. But hopefully getting out to communities where they didn't normally have access to this, because you always had to go to the big fancy hospitals. That's another thing that's really going to bring the care to everybody.
Yeah. That decentralized, having worked in rural areas, and working on healthcare, I was doing AIDS education in rural Thailand, back in the early 90s when we didn't have any HIV related medication, but certainly bringing, even information to these places. So can you talk a little bit about the storytelling, of how do we actually get people internally to hop on board with these breakthrough ideas when we're shifting from the status quo of centralized clinical trials to this decentralization? Michelle, what's the story that you tell on the inside, and get other people to tell this story so that it clicks, that people get it?
So we actually had an idea that was submitted by a colleague within the group, Julian Kroll, and he said, he worked for years in procurement. He came over and was working in clinical operations. He says, we have such a problem. Every time we tried to pitch this approach to our study teams, they all say, oh yeah, this is so great. We see the benefits. But then they always said, but not in my study. Do it in someone else's study first. And he says, there's got to be a way that we can build the trust with the study teams or find out what's going on. So we did a root cause analysis trying to figure out, well, why is it a problem? Why don't you want it in there? And we found a lot of different pieces. A lot of it was the fear of the unknown is so strong. I don't know how burdensome this is going to be. I don't know how much time it's going to take to have this new approach considered. And I'm being held by timelines. I don't know what the data is going to look like when we do get data in from these devices. I don't know how to filter out the noise. I don't know how much space all of this is going to take. And I don't know if I can properly explain it to my research sites and feel comfortable and knowledgeable to do it. So we said, okay, how can we solve for those 6 problems? What can we do that can make a difference? And he came up with this idea for a tech for trial approach, which the concept was basically employee testing. Employee testing does not take the space of testing with real patients. I just want to make that clear, but it can really help you understand and see what it's like. So we decided we could do these things in 30 days or less of testing of these new technologies and let people from Bear sign up to be a participant. A lot of the study team signed up because they were curious. Then they would go through a protocol just as if they were a patient using
Wow.
these on a regular basis. And we would get their feedback. We'd find out what went well, what needs improvement? What kind of support would we need to provide if we wanted to put it in a trial? How was the relationship between the vendor and us as well, to say, did we have a good conversation going back and forth? Were they willing to work with us? Did they have information to help us? Like, how did that go? And then also, what was the logistical considerations? Because now you're shipping all this stuff out to people and you're having to get it back from people. And that's a little bit of a challenge too. So we learned all this stuff, and then we were able to do a lessons learned report at the end and say, okay, all of these things we tested, this is what we learned. And this is, if we want to put it in your trial, what we can improve on. And these are how we would improve it, but really set you up for success. And this is what the data looks like. And this is how you would store it. And this is how you filter out the noise. Once they had these things and they experienced it, an amazing thing happened. All of a sudden, people started saying, oh my gosh, this would be perfect for this patient population, or I could see where this would really help somebody. We had one test where they were like, I wish my dad had this just all the time. Once they feel like that, they become a champion then for it. And they're more willing to say, hey, let's put it in my trial. The other thing we heard was people felt like they were so much better informed of what the expectations were. They felt comfortable having to talk to the sites about it, to explain it to them, what would be expected from them. And also we knew what their burden was going to be, and we could create already the support tools and things. So maybe you get a little laminated card that if these things happen, this is what you do. And it's proactive instead of reactive, which made a big difference. So that went so well. And now it got fully implemented. So it was like a proof of concept. We did it in 3 different user tests, and everything came back really valuable. So it went well. We had a few bumps in the road along the way, but it really went well. And even the bumps that we had would save us dramatically. If we would have put it in a trial before doing the test, it could have been really a big problem for us. But because we did the test first, it saved us. So that was also a good thing.
How so, Michelle? What was one of those bumps that you found?
So we had done a study before, and we had these devices, and we thought, oh, we'll use these same devices in a test to see if we could, without the vendor, repurpose it and put it into a clinical trial based on what we learned. So it was even me that was in charge of it. I had to set up these devices for the participants, and I was sending them out. And when you put everything on, you put it in a little docking station, you go into your computer, you set it all up, and then you go to send it out. Well, it sat for a little bit because I got them all ready, and then I had to wait for addresses to send them. And I was nervous about the battery dying. So right before I sent them out, I thought, oh, I'm just going to charge them all up. It'll have a brand new fresh charge. It's going to be great. And I'll send it out. So I did that. And then we're waiting, and there's no data coming in. Like, there's nothing. I don't see anything. Then we thought, oh, there's a problem transmitting the data. But once we get the devices back, it'll be fine. No, we got the devices back and they were blank, because we found out afterwards, by me putting them back on the charger, it reset the configuration. And so it didn't know what to capture. So it didn't capture anything at all. So if we would have had that in a study right, and had a site, about to send it to their patients and just thought they were doing a good thing, we could have a big, huge amount of patients with no data in the study. So
right. That's like me forgetting to hit record on the podcast. I get it in there.
Yes.
Yeah. So, I love hearing this story, because it's a rare opportunity when an employee, right, actually gets to experience what the patient will experience. And for those of us in innovation who are creating these breakthrough things, I mean, maybe test driving a car is similar. So you get a sense of what the passenger, whether it's the new model of a Tesla that's coming out, you get to feel what the customer feels. But in something like this, for a nurse or a clinician to really understand what the patient will be going through, I can only imagine that the level of empathy that takes place over the course of it, and the ability now to arm an entire group of executors, right, of implementers with stories of, oh my God, the same thing happened to me.
Yeah.
That's a level of empathy that you wouldn't normally experience in a clinical trial, because the clinician typically has no idea what you're going through in the process. So kudos to you. I mean, that's really such a valuable skill set now that clinician team has in executing the clinical trial too. So fantastic. We could all use more empathy in our, certainly, and especially in our healthcare settings when we're really at times of crisis and stress. So as if we need more cortisol injected right into a stressful clinical trial situation. But Michelle, you've since left Bayer and you've started your own consultancy. Tell us a little bit about that move.
Yeah, and it was the strangest thing. I've never left a company that I loved before. So usually you leave a company because you're mad at them, or you leave a company because you have this wonderful opportunity, you just couldn't pass it up. I actually left because I needed to refocus a little bit on health and wellness of my family, and kind of be there for them and then for myself, and kind of juggle things. And I thought, how can I innovate what I'm doing and actually turn it inside and still help people, because I have this huge passion to help people. And I came up with the concept of innovating what you do, because I say it all the time. It's been my tagline on my email for all these years now. And I thought I can do some business consulting and talk about how do we move the needle forward for our clinical trial space, but I could also run innovation workshops, because that's where I really see things changing dramatically. You see people talking for months and months about a problem, but I can put them in a workshop for a half a day or a full day, and all of a sudden they accomplished even more than what they did for the last 3 months talking about it. So maybe we can make change faster this way, and it gives me a little more flexibility to also, focus on family, which is an important piece for me. So I get to help both my family and patients in general by doing it.
Yeah. And so are the kinds of companies that you'll be working with, I imagine, are other pharma companies that want to be doing all the great things that you've been doing.
Yeah, so there's a lot of small and mid-range pharma companies that don't have innovation functions like we had. And even some of the larger ones don't have innovation functions. So to be able to offer that as a service to them, and then be able to kind of test it out. And then even if they decided to create one, since I've done it already and developed it, I could help them create their own innovation function. So that's nice. But I have been kind of on the side mentoring all kinds of different groups and people looking to get into the clinical trial space. So we see these tech companies come in and they say, oh, I think this might apply to clinical trials. They don't know the rules and regulations. They don't understand how the rigor of the regulated process works, or even the terminology sometimes. So I try to help them with, how do you talk the right talk in order to be taken seriously in this world? So some of it's just that, but also some of it's user testing, like being able to do those workshops for these tech companies to say, okay, let's just see, what are people actually thinking? Because a lot of them, they only try it on themselves. They don't try it on actual patients with these conditions. And they don't realize if someone has crepey skin because of their medical condition and you're putting stickers on it, when you peel the sticker off, it's going to be a problem, right? So some of that is also something. So I think anything in that clinical trial space is an area where I can, kind of use my powers for good. So
Here. So, we typically finish up these conversations on the Innovation Storyteller Show with a couple of hot seat questions. So let me ask you, what do you think is the greatest innovation in human history? And you can give me a couple of your top faves. What are the innovations that you most admire?
that's a hard one, because they have been so many different things. I think for me, the airplane is one of my favorite innovations. It's been around now for a long time and people forget it was an innovation, but it was at one point, because really it allowed us to start connecting with other people and getting outside of our space. And without that, I always say we need diversity and inclusion for impactful innovation. And without having the airplane, we wouldn't have had a chance to meet and learn about all these different people and cultures all over the place. So definitely that's probably one of the top of my list.
And amazing to think that from that moment, right? I think we're at 119 years since Kitty Hawk, right? Since Orville and his brother there created the first usable airplane. And now we are taking trips to the moon as tourists. Right.
It's insane. It's great.
And that's 119 years. I mean, that is nearly one human lifetime, right? There are certainly some people who have lived on this planet 120 years. They've seen that entire evolution.
Yeah. So I would say definitely one of my favorites.
Yeah. So if you had a chance to join any innovation team in history, what team would you like to be on?
Oh,
Had your hand in creating something exceptional?
also interesting. I feel like a lot of people would say something around the group that had created the iPhone to begin with, or something of
Yep.
that nature. And I would probably fall into the same camp because I love task unification. And anytime you can have multiple different things all captured in one location, and it really be something that is user focused, and that's kind of a primary piece of the way they created it. I think that would be really, really cool. But I think so many different medications. Like, I would have loved to have been involved in even creating the first antibiotics, or, the first cancer
Excellent.
therapies. I think that would be super rewarding too.
Fantastic. Okay. And then a pet peeve that you have about something that exists in the world that you'd love to see innovated, that you would love to see fixed, or something you just love, that you'd love to see expounded upon and innovated even further.
I think one of the biggest pet peeves is the fact that we overuse a strength of ours and we don't even realize we're doing it. And I think we have a way to innovate that. So our strength is being a protector. So I don't know how many times you see a situation where a new idea or something comes up and people are like, well, these are all the challenges there. And they start ripping it apart and saying everything that could be bad about it. Because in their DNA, way back from caveman time and the fire, like, oh, don't touch the fire, we have it ingrained in us to be a good protector. And it works great for a regular part of our job, but for innovation, it's so bad. So I really try to encourage people, let's talk benefits before challenges, because if there's no benefits, we don't even have to go down that path, right? And it'll make it much faster. But if there are benefits, then now there's a passion with people to try to find workarounds for the challenges that we do find, because everything's going to have a challenge. So that would be what we have to innovate, is our culture and doing that on a regular basis.
So that's cultivating the downplaying of the critic, right? And being a little bit more open to possibility.
Yeah. And I think, it's not downplaying the critic. We need the critic. We need to know what those challenges are. So vital and important to set us up for success. But we just need to do it in a different order. We need to make sure before we do that, that we have a chance to really explore where the benefit lies and who does this benefit, because that also makes a big difference before we go into the other path. So I wouldn't want to get rid of all of my critics out there either, because if you can win them over, you also know that you got something really good. So.
Well said. Was that, Michelle, thank you so much for joining me on the show today. Where can people get in touch with you?
So innovateinwhatyoudo.com will take you to my website, and there's links in there to reach out to me or to ask questions or anything else. So thanks.
And we can find you on LinkedIn as well, Michelle.
Absolutely. Yep.
Thank you so much for joining me today, Michelle. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Susan, for the opportunity.